Hey everyone, welcome back to a lifetime of Mafia Tales. I'm your host Adrian Martinez, and of course I'm joined by my co-host who was a Colombo mobster. His name's Salvatore Polisi, also known as Sally Ubats. Today we talk about his relationship with the Bonanno crime family boss Joe Massino. Sal met Joe Massino before he became the boss of the crime family. In this episode, Sal talks about digging a hole for a murder that didn't happen. The Mafia guys that were included in this hit were Joe Massino, Dominic Cataldo, and Tutti Francis, who was the nephew to Sonny Francis. We also talk about a man that was a Bonanno associate. He was a German as well. His name is Dwayne Lessenheim, also known as Goldie. Another topic that me and Sal talk about during this interview is Sal selling cars to Roy DeMeo and John Carniglia. They both were members of the Gambino crime family. The last thing that we talk about on this podcast is Vinny Basciano may be getting a new trial. Please subscribe to my Patreon to get this full interview. Also, please subscribe to my channel if you want to get more interviews like this. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. One quick thing before we get started with this podcast. This episode is just half of it. The rest of it's on Patreon. If you want to get our full podcast, please subscribe to our Patreon channel. Our Patreon channel link is in the video description below. All right, we're back, Sal. How you doing today, man?
Good, very good.
Well, I'm really excited for today's episode. We're going to be talking about Joe Massino, the boss of the Bonanno family that became an informant, and what your relationship was with him and some of his associates that were with him as well, like Goldie, the German associate. I don't think there was many of them guys, but they called him Blondie, the blonde sheep of the family. But we're gonna go into detail with that and how what work Sal did for Joe Massino, and back then you couldn't ask questions. So yeah, we'll just go into it, Sal. So what was your relationship with Joe Massino, and how did you get close with him?
Well, I didn't really have a relationship with him. The only way I got to know him was sometime in the summer of '72, I think it was. Cataldo came to me and said, look, I got a piece of work for you to do. There's a witness that's going to testify against a good friend of mine. He didn't even tell me who it was, but obviously we later learned it was Rusty Rastelli, the head of the Bonanno family. So Dominic Cataldo said, look, this is the guy's name. This is his address. And I already spoke to John Gotti. You'll be doing this with Foxy. I go, really? Yeah, Foxy and you got this assignment to do a favor for a friend of mine. He didn't tell me it was Messina at the time. Okay, so they give us the address. We go, we look at the location. They tell us the guy comes out every morning like 6:45 to walk his dog, which this became part of the Sinatra Club movie, actually.
I recall.
Got a witness. So I said to Foxy, well, what are we going to do? We got to get some equipment. Okay, so we go to the sports store. I was a big Mickey Mantle fan, so I got a Mickey Mantle bat. And Foxy, he was a jokester. He said, well, we don't need to hit a home run. I'll get a Pete Rose bat. Because Pete Rose was known for singles, not home runs.
Not home runs.
Okay, so we go, we watch one night. One night we talk about it all night, and we go the next morning and we watch. About 6 a.m, we see the guy come out with a mailman's jacket on. He walks the dog and goes back in. I say, okay. He says, let's do this tomorrow. So the following day we get there and we're waiting for the guy to come out, maybe a half a block away. Guy comes out with the dog with a mailman's jacket on, a short jacket. And we get out of the car. We start walking faster. Before you know it, we both crack the guy over his head. He goes down. We're supposed to break his leg. So Foxy worked on one leg. I worked on the other leg. We beat this guy. He was crying, screaming, yelling, bleeding. After a couple of minutes, we just never said a word to the guy. Went back to our car and left. And that was it. That was the assignment that we had. Didn't know his name. Didn't know who told us to do this. All I knew was Cataldo says, you got to do me this favor. And as far as Foxy, he said, Gotti told him, hey, you go with Ubats, meaning me, and you give this guy a beating. And that's it. So that's what we did. We really never talked about it. Maybe 6 months or a year later, I don't remember. Cataldo said, hey, let's take a ride. Well, every once in a while, we'd go to Maspeth, where Joe Pegleg Brancata was the acting head of the Colombo family. We'd go in there, we'd have coffee with him and leave him an envelope with a few $100s. We'd be out for a couple hours that day, Cataldo and I. Say, look, I want to bring you over to meet this friend of mine. I didn't know who I was meeting. I go into this delicatessen, and it's Joe Massino's place. And he's got a whole bunch of trucks, food trucks. We called them roach coaches in those days. And he came around from the side of the counter, shook my hand. He said, I just wanted to thank you for what you did with that witness. That was, something to help me out, help a friend of mine, which was, he didn't tell me it was Rastelli. He didn't tell me he was the head of the Bonanno family. No. So we shook hands, and that was it. And then Cataldo and I left, and we hadn't talked about Messina for a while. Well, maybe, I don't know, a year or two later, I ran into him with Cataldo. I think we were at a wedding or something. Daughter got married, a mob guy's daughter. And I said, hello, we shook hands, And Foxy and I really never talked about it. So years went by. Well, maybe 5-6 years. And one day Cataldo came to me and said, hey, let's go have a sandwich by Joey's joint. Joe Massino was Massmith, 5-10 minutes away from Ozone Park where we live. So we go over there and we're talking, and then Joe says, oh, I hear you got a pretty good, chop business going, dismantling cars. I go, yeah, I do a lot of cars, I didn't tell him that I was selling cars to John Caniglia, who was a hitman for Gotti, and I was also selling cars to Roy DeMeo, because in those days you didn't tell one guy that you were doing business with another guy the same type of business. So then Messina says to me, hey, I got a guy with me. He could use some work. He's a good car thief. I go, really? Who is he? He says, his name is Goldie. I'll send him over to your place. Maybe a week or so later, this guy comes in. He's got blonde hair, and he didn't know who I was. He said to my secretary, where is Sal? Oh, she goes, he's in the back of the shop, Comes in, introduces himself. He said, Joey sent me. He said, you need cars. I go, yeah. Well, can you do Cadillacs? He said, yeah. I said, I'll give you an order for Cadillacs, 5 Cadillacs a week, almost one every day. And when you get the car, you call me in the middle of the night, and I'll meet you on such and such a street. You'll drop the car off. I'll drive you back to where you got to go, and I'll pay you by the car, or I'll pay you by the week. He said, okay, great. I give him an order for a 70, I don't remember, maybe a 76 or 77 Coupe de Ville. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'd tell him what color it was. He gets the car perfect. This went on for a few weeks. I'd give him his money, and he was good. He was always there on time. He wasn't like a junkie who didn't show up. If I gave him an order for 4 Cadillacs, 5 Cadillacs, he'd get them at the end of the week. I'd pay him the money. I was paying $60 or $80 per car in those days, but I gave him $100. So Messina asked me, give him a little extra. So I give him $100 a car.
Yeah, just for riding them.
Yeah, those cars in turn, I would chop them up and get $1,000 out of a car.
Oh,
so
okay.
That was the car business. But I didn't hear much about Messina for a while. Maybe in 77, 78, Cataldo said, look, we got to whack this guy. You don't have to be there when we get whacked, but when we get the guy whacked, but I'll put it on record that you're involved in this killing. We're going to take this guy out. All you got to do is go out to Long Island and dig a grave for him. So I believe it was maybe the summer of 77, something like that, 78. I went out there and dug this grave, spent all night, got blisters on my hands, went back and was waiting for a call the next morning. I was supposed to go to a building and pick up this body and then drive it out and dump it in this grave I built, dug. I didn't get a call from Cataldo. Finally, about 2 days later, he calls me. I'll go meet him for coffee. He said, you better go out there and fill that grave up. We didn't get the guy. He said, Joey and I, which he meant Messina, Joey and I, and a guy named Tutti Franzese, who was Sonny Franzese's nephew. We were supposed to do this piece of work, and the guy didn't show up. So I go out and I fill up the grave. It took me all night to to dig. Okay. I had a
Mm-hmm.
stolen truck. I mean, all that kind of stuff. And I talked about the grave that I dug in the play I did. I talked about the grave I dug, I think, in Symmetrical Book with my co-writer, Steve Dougherty. After a while, I was coaching football that fall. Cataldo comes to the football field. Now, what was interesting about the football field was my kid was like 10, 11 years old, and I had half a dozen kids that were sons of mob guys and criminals.
Right.
My right guard was Peter Gotti Jr.,
Jeez. I
Pete
mean,
Gotti's son. My
right.
left guard was Mark Ryder. I had Greg Ryder as one of my players. I had Anthony. Let's see, what was his name? This is 40 years ago. Anyway, I had a whole bunch of Italian guys, and they all, were on my team. And Peter Gotti would be walking the sideline. Occasionally John Gotti showed up. His son Frankie was on my team, the kid that got killed in the minibike. And then Cataldo grabbed a hold of me at halftime and said, "Hey, I want to tell you something." He said, "Remember that guy you dug the grave for?" "Yeah." He said, "We got him last night." I said, "We got him?" He said, "Yeah, I was in this house and I was hiding in the closet with Joe Massino and Tootie, and the guy showed up. And I came out and we strangled him." "So what'd you do with the body?" I mean, you weren't supposed to ask these questions, but this was years after I was around Cataldo. He said, "We just dumped it in the street in Long Island City. So just forget about it. I want you to know we did it. And just to let you know, the follow-up, you were involved, but, you didn't really participate in this. So you have to do something else if you want to get made." And I didn't say a word. I wasn't interested in doing anything else. But basically, I hadn't seen Messina for a while, and I didn't know that he was jockeying to become the head of the family. I mean, I wasn't paying attention to the politics of the mob back in those days. You weren't supposed to ask, and I wasn't interested in asking. By 1980, I was backing away, and that might have been the last time I saw Messina.
And
So, years went by, and then I want to say I think I did the Gotti trial in 86, the summer. Maybe a few months later, the government called me. I went to a secret meeting, and they said, "We want you to be a witness in the Joe Massino case." I didn't even know he had a case going. I wasn't paying attention. So I did testify at a case that Massino was involved in, but he didn't get convicted of the murder because I talked about the murder, but I didn't know who the guy was that they murdered. Didn't know the name.
No names or nothing.
Yeah, and I think he did get convicted, and I think he went to jail at that time. But I didn't pay attention anymore, so I wasn't interested. I didn't ask the FBI for questioning. I just didn't care about what the mob was doing.
At that point, what was he when you left? Like in around the 80s, you said in the early 80s, that was the last time you seen Messina. Was he even like an underboss or anything?
I don't know.
Oh,
I didn't.
nothing.
I didn't pay attention to anybody's rise in the mob. I mean, you could read about it in the papers, but
Right.
I never put any stock in anything that was a rumor in papers. I mean, I talked about things that I was involved in, and like I said before, if I was there, I would talk about it. But it wasn't something I was going to talk about that I heard secondhand information. I mean, I did, later on hear about Messina flipping because the attorney that had my case in federal court, he was also in Goodfellas. He played himself, Ed McDonald. He secretly was assigned to represent Messina at the end when he flipped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All those years went by. I mean, who would have guessed the head of a family would flip?
No, I mean, that's the thing. Like, that's what I really wanted to ask you too. Is like, what were your thoughts? Because you already had flipped. You became an informant. I mean, when he decided to become one, I think early 2000s. But like, your mindset would have been different if it was in the 70s when you were really in it and active. So, what was your thoughts when he did become one?
Yeah, I did consider myself a witness. That's what I became in the Gotti case.
Mm-hmm.
So for a short time, when I worked the Brennan, the judge's case between the fall of 84 and 85, I wasn't out there giving information about people. I was working on one criminal case, federal case on the judge that was corrupt. And then eventually I testified at the Gotti trial and then the Messina trial. I mean, that was the extent of my cooperation. I testified at a couple of trials, and it wasn't that I was out there long term like Joe Pistone or like Henry Hill or Willie Boy Johnson. These guys were out there for years giving information. That wasn't my intention to give information. I
Right.
was just able to tell a few stories about my involvement with these guys in organized crime.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they
And
call you an informant. Well, I think an informant is out there giving information, informing the government. That
for
wasn't
many years.
really, it wasn't really my position. They can call you whatever they can call you. They can call you an informant, a rat, a stool pigeon, a witness. The bottom line is, if you're going to clean up your life, you got to lay it all out and not look back. And that was it. And eventually, I walked away from crime and never once was involved in crime after I went into the program. That was the
Yeah.
end of my life in crime.
And I think, eventually me and you want to get some of those wire recordings that you did. I think that'd be make for a really good, interesting segment. And I think a lot of the people that follow and watch our show will enjoy that once we're able to get that and we can see what particular guys you have on there.
I read, I did read a lot about the Messina case because I knew him and he had this meteoric rise. I mean, he rose to the top of the family. And at the end, when he flipped, I wasn't surprised that he had $6 million in gold that he gave back to the government, because he was the wheeler and a dealer. He was the trader. He did all kinds of things. I have no clue on how much crime he was involved with, whether it was paper crime or stock market, manipulation or whatever he was doing. But he was involved in every type of crime. Whether or not he was doing drugs, that I didn't know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that really ever did come to light that he got convicted on. I mean, a lot of stuff. I mean, a lot of murders and all that. I mean, when
Right,
people
right.
did that, I mean, that's probably why he's like, okay, well, if all my people are flipping on me, he's like, I'm ready to flip back, and
Yeah, yeah.
because he helped.
I think Ed McDonald told me that when he finally got out of prison some years ago, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, he was very sick. He was ill, had all kinds of, medical problems, and they hit him out somewhere, I mean, wherever. I mean, some of the recordings that he did were kind of comical with the real Pistone, the Joe
Yeah,
Pistone, the guy that was playing Donnie Brasco. So that whole issue, I mean, Cataldo was very close to them. And I think he knew more about, the Donnie Brasco storyline than most people knew. I wasn't interested. Again, I started back in the way, in the late 70s, early 80s. I just didn't want to associate with a lot of guys. And I was dealing drugs. So you had to be real careful, not let anybody know, that you were a drug dealer. So I isolated myself. I maybe said hello to Gotti once in a while or, Cataldo, but slowly around 1980, I was backing away. I really
yeah.
was. I could see where it was going. The guy's getting whacked out, especially after the Lufthansa heist.
Oh yeah, with the Lucchese's and all them other guys that
Right,
were involved with it.
right, right.
I mean, that'd be a whole segment in itself that we could
Yeah,
cover, and
that's a
but
different story. The thing about the guys that they started to let in, I knew a guy from the 60s. He owned a bar and nobody even knew who he was. Somehow he got involved with Lucchese's. His name was Joe DeFiti. I heard he actually became the head of the family. And this guy was a bartender. He owned a bar. He wasn't a tough guy. He wasn't a professional thief. Somehow he rose to run the family. Eventually, they kicked him to the side. And I think he also flipped. He flipped and he died, poor down in Florida or something. But I knew the guy. I was surprised. I looked at him like I looked at Peter Gotti. Peter Gotti was not a tough guy. He just happened to be the brother of
yeah,
John. Stepped in. I was like in shock and he wasn't even a bright guy because he was a garbage man. He was a New York City garbage man.
not a wise guy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so another way that we could segue now is to you know, Joe Massino and John Gotti and all these guys, they were pretty close. I mean, what I read in Tony's book was what I was telling you is I think like they formed a good relationship because they had like a vacation house or something on the same neighborhood block, and he got Gotti with the Gambinos. They hid some bodies for Joe Massino. They had a lot of internal beef. So I mean, with Joe Massino, I mean, he probably had certain people that he didn't want, becoming the boss or trying to give him any. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he was upset with some of his guys, so I think he
Yeah,
took him out, and then Gotti hit him, or him and the Gambinos. I have no clue, but it
yeah.
all it all came out in court or something like that. But got to
I
sneeze.
think I think there was some kind of commonality because Gotti had an upstate vacation house. It was in a little town in Pennsylvania, which was only about 10, 15 minutes from my racetrack. And at the same time, Messina had a place up there that I think Goldie's family had something to do with. So they were both hiding out in upstate New York, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things they shared, I think. This is what
Yeah, I read that the other day with that
yeah,
Goldie is that he was hiding out. Joe, he was helping him hide, and I think it was for like a couple years it was, and then
right,
eventually he got caught, and the Goldie he first took the charge. He went to jail. He went to prison
right.
for Joe Messina, and then the second one he's like, no. I mean the lawyers came to him and said, do you really want to go to prison again for this guy?
Again,
And he's
yeah,
like, no, no, not really. So
yeah. And that was an example, like I told you, was here's the guy that stole cars from me for like 2 years. And I knew his name Goldie. I never knew his real name. And that's
yeah.
part of the way it was back in the day in the mob. If you knew a guy named Peanuts, you might have known that his name was Paulie Peanuts or Paulie Walnuts or whatever,
Not
but
his
you
full
never
name.
knew his real name.
Yeah, I think that Goldie's it's like Dwayne or Dwayne
Yeah.
Lessenheim.
Yeah. I,
That's how I'm reading. It's German, man. I don't
yeah.
know.
I didn't.
It's a little trickier than the Italian names.
Yeah. He went into the program, and I guess I don't know if he's alive or not, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting because, back in those days, a lot of times a mob family from one crew would get in contact with another guy that was involved with a different family and then use some of the hitters and tough guys and killers so that they could keep keep the heat off of who they were killing or what they were doing by using somebody from another family. It was like a favor
Yeah.
that would
And
give them some coverage.
yeah, like in your example, they wanted you to do it with the Gambinos,
Right,
with Foxy and
right, right,
Dominic Cataldo. I mean, and that's working with the Bonannos, like
right.
do a certain hit. You know what I mean? But
Yeah,
it's not like it's a crime. I mean, I'm sure you did the Five Family Heist, but
yeah,
more of if they want an internal hit done, they're gonna have the other family. So if they get busted or caught, then they're like, oh well, it must have been a beef. Yeah, I mean, eventually, but Joe Massino, with him, like he really helped rebuild the family because they were always having those internal wars and everything
right.
like that, and like
Yeah.
he was really like a paranoid dude. I mean, did you get that from him? Like in 1970, was he always like that?
I didn't feel that. I mean, I read about him later on that he wouldn't allow people to talk. But
Right.
because the government's technology got so sophisticated, he was worried about wiretaps.
Yeah.
Really.
And I think that I read too that they would point to their ear when they would refer to him is what he would have his people talk
Yeah.
like. You
Yeah, I
know,
heard something.
like Chen, he would have the Chen, and then
Yeah.
Joe would have that. So I thought that was interesting. But I mean, he would eventually go to take down the whole family after rebuilding it for all them years. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Well, I think it was a bad experience to have Donnie Brasco inside the whole crew at the upper family structure. I mean, he got right in there and caused, it was embarrassing for the mob. It became very embarrassing because you're responsible for whoever you bring into the family business.
hmm I mean, did you ever read that Joe Massino and Donnie Brasco ever had like a one-on-one encounter or just being together? in a group setting.
I didn't read that. I didn't know that. I never asked a lot of questions. Once I went to the other side, I probably could have asked a lot of questions from the feds, but I
Hmm.
wasn't interested.
Yeah.
Once I left New York City, I had a completely different life. There was nothing illegal in my life. I mean, basically, the only thing I did was I snuck a whole bunch of gold and diamonds, from New York to Texas, and that was it. Eventually, eventually liquidating all of that and getting into a couple of businesses, straight businesses, not anything illegal, never again. And, that was hard for a lot of people to believe that I just went straight as an arrow.
Yeah, because I mean, you think there is, cases like, for one instance that a lot of people could know is like, Sammy with the Bull. I think he became an informant, then got involved with drugs and everything.
Right,
After that, he became
right.
was ecstasy or something like that, and
Yeah, he was dealing drugs after they put him in the program.
yeah,
He got another 20 years. He went to jail again.
yeah. I think even in the case of the Patriarcha family, Joe. Or not Joe, Joe Barboza. Yeah, he had killed someone after being in the program. I don't know if it was a few, but for sure one. And then eventually he ended up getting murdered. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's certain guys that don't change, but then there is the ones like you that okay, I don't want to be
Yeah,
involved in this
most
anymore.
of them just continued a life of crime. Some of them got away with it because the government covered up their stuff. I mean, Henry was dealing drugs, and 2 or 3 times Ed McDonald saved him, from going
Really?
back to jail. Henry, yeah, yeah, he was a
Yeah.
very sympathetic guy, though. Henry, he really was.
Yeah, I mean, he that is interesting too. I think he was the one that was in Nebraska, like while he was in the
Right,
witness protection
right,
program, and
right.
I think I heard stories about him
Yeah,
being, drinking a lot. He was kind of like an alcoholic in his towards the end of his life and
right.
stuff. But
Well, it
yeah, I
was
don't know.
interesting because, when you go into the program, you're supposed to be hiding.
Mhm.
So in 1992, my son graduated college and he came to stay with me in LA for a while. And one day I said, "Hey, you know what? Let's go out to the desert, Palmdale area. Henry is out there." And he invited us out to have dinner on Sunday. He goes, "Dad, you mean Henry Hill?" I go, "Yeah, Henry from Goodfellas." So we drive out there and we spend the day out there with him. And of course, my son was like on the way back home, he's like, "Wow, he just didn't look like, the Henry Hill in the movie." Because Henry was small, he was kind of scrawny, he was dried up alcoholic drug user, and you kind of felt sorry for him that his life was isolated out there on the desert.
Yeah.
And when my kids saw him and we drove back to LA, my kid says, "Dad, after I saw Goodfellas, I thought this guy was bigger than life." I go, "Well, people should know that leaving the mob is not exciting. There's nothing like, this is not the golden era of life in Hollywood." I go, so my kid got to spend a couple hours with him, and he goes, "What was he like?" I go, "He was a drug dealer all his life. He was a drug dealer. I knew him in the 70s. Then I knew Henry in prison in 74. And then after that, I didn't see him. And he showed up out in California, and we happened to be interviewed by the same CBS, and we talk because Henry would talk about, yeah, Joe Massino. He had all the information, whether it was Joe Massino, whether it was Casso, all these guys that were part of the top of organized crime in each family. Henry would talk about them because he made it his business to ask the FBI, you know, all
And
kinds of questions.
yeah, and that's what I was gonna say. I mean, did he ever bring up anything, just for this video's sake about Joe Messina?
No, he didn't. I mean, he knew of him,
Hmm.
but the funny thing about Henry was he didn't participate, with guys from other families. He was really isolated with Paulie Vario and the Lucchese's. So I mean, that's what Henry
Did
was about.
he just strictly wanted to stick with them, or what
Yeah,
do you
he was.
think?
He was connected to Vario and that whole crew, and Jimmy Burke. Because that was his protector, and he dealt drugs for years until the end, like in the movie when he flipped. Now, I don't
Right.
know what Messina did with drugs. I have no idea. I've never read his history. Whatever they wrote about him, because most of the time that stuff is exaggerated. It's not even accurate.
Hmm.
What journalists put together.
Did Henry Hill? He knew of Tommy DeSimone then too.
Oh, they were good
They're
friends.
good friends, yeah.
Oh yeah, Tommy and him were good friends. Yeah.
Were they in
But
prison together with you at that one point?
yeah, we were all in Lewisburg.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
he did home pretty well.
Oh, Henry was there. Henry was assigned to the butcher shop, and Paulie would have him bring all the best cuts of meat up to the room where they were cutting up the garlic and cooking the food. I mean, I was there, and I, looked at the way the prison was being run, and eventually, I'll talk about that, about who ran the prison in the '70s because they got away with a lot.
Yeah.
They paid off everybody. I believe they even paid off the warden. So we'll see when we get to that point of 1974
Yeah.
and life behind bars. It was a joke. I mean, Lewisburg was a joke at that time.
Right. And see, that's what I want to let everyone know as well is that me and Sal we're going to be doing a segment about multiple segments about each guy that he was in prison with. I mean, the list really goes on. The ones that you sent me, I think there was almost about 20 of them or something that I went and found pictures. But these guys included the ones from the Gambino family, Colombo, Philadelphia, Lucchese, Genovese. I mean, just a lot of them. So we're gonna really get into it, and it's like each one of these guys back then, they weren't at that full level status yet, but they would blossom into this giant, mafia figure. But back then, like just like when you met Joe Massino back in '72, like they were just a regular associate maybe, or
they weren't even made guys.
Yeah, they're just associates.
Gotti wasn't a made guy. Cataldo wasn't. Massino. They were working on building a reputation so they could be proposed, for membership. But Messina had his own ideas. He was pretty clever. I mean, he sort of recruited a lot of tough guys. And I don't even know all that went on with him because most of that stuff was like rumor. And again, you didn't ask. You didn't ask questions in the 70s. You did not do that.
No, I would imagine not, because if you did, then they're going to think you're a Fed, or they're going to, they're going to think something's up right away. So, I mean, you just did what you were told. And just like with the whole beating up the mailman thing. I mean, you just did it. Didn't have no knowledge about this guy.
No, and
anything.
You had no skin in the game. I mean, you just did a favor. That's what they call doing a favor, And as far as I knew, Cataldo was involved with Messina to do with some hijackings because Cataldo didn't let out all he was doing. He just didn't do it back in the 70s. No.
And I was going to ask you too, is like, so when I think what I understand is like when they would ask people to do favors like yourself, I mean, you don't get anything out of it except that you like money or any kind of reward. It's just like, yes, I was a good kid. And I mean, they'll say that about you or something, and I guess people can pick up what that means.
Well, we were in our 20s and we would do anything for mob guys. We were still making a reputation. So, you got a thank you, you got a handshake, and you got a little bit of acknowledgement. But you didn't even talk about, the ins and outs or whatever you did, not the detail. I saw Messina months later. He shook hands. Hey, thanks for taking care of that witness. That was it. That's all. You never talked about it again.
Yeah. So, I mean, after that, it's just like, it's interesting. I mean, because there's different, with the mafia and different gangs. I mean, you think the mafia works together with different families, but like the gangs, like you say, like Bloods and Crips, I mean, they don't really want to work together. I mean, that's completely different between the mafia. And so, like, why do you think that mutual respect is there with the Italians?
I don't know, but, I was shocked to hear that Castellano in his last days was involved with the Irish guys from Manhattan. There was a whole bunch of Irish guys that were pretty vicious, from Manhattan. So they managed, I don't know who set up that sit down, but they managed to quell all kinds of violence between the Irish guys and the Italians. If you read about it, I mean, I don't know how much is true, but I heard there was an actual sit down between Castellano and a guy named Mickey Featherstone. These guys were pretty badass Irish gangsters.
So. And so I mean, for them to work together, I mean, that's something different, and just like with the whole Joey Gallo thing, I mean, they said him working with African American gangs and stuff, they just really blew people away at that point. But
the structure of organized crime with like Messina, even though he asked me to give Goldie work to steal cars so he helped Goldie make some money. Okay. I don't know what else they were doing on other levels. I have no idea. It was like at the same time that I was in that stolen car business, I was selling to John Caniglia and his brother. They were murderers, okay? And then I was also selling to Roy DeMeo, who nobody knew I was selling to DeMeo. And I never knew what DeMeo was doing in the Gemini Lounge. I later found out, shook my head, oh my God, this is the guy who was selling stolen car parts to, and he was murdering people every day above a bar and draining their blood.
If you want to continue watching this episode, because this is only the halfway mark, please subscribe to our Patreon channel. We offer all of our exclusive interviews on there. Our Patreon link is in the video description below. Hey, thanks for watching this clip. This clip came from our Patreon channel. The name of our podcast is A Lifetime of Mafia Tales. Me and Sal's podcast is all about his life in the Mafia. Salvatore was a Colombo associate. Salvatore, also known as Sally Ubats, has many stories about committing crimes with all 5 of the New York crime families, such as hijacking, bank robberies, heists, and much more. Sal has many criminal stories about him and other high-ranking mobsters, such as John Gotti, Peter Gotti, Gene Gotti, Jimmy Burke, Angelo Ruggiero, Henry Hill, Dave Icovetti Sr., Tommy DeSimone, Dominic Cataldo, Joe Brancato, and many more. During his time as a mobster, he had a social club he opened called the Sinatra Club. He would later go on to write a book and a movie about his time in the Sinatra Club. Sal has a lot of untold stories about John Gotti that people haven't heard. And as myself, my name is Adrian Martinez. I've been doing a podcast for the last 2 years. It's called Invest in Yourself Podcast. I've done a number of Mafia interviews the last few years. I've done interviews with Mafia associates, made men, and capos, also known as bosses. Salvatore and I have decided to partner up to start our own podcast, to drop some new untold stories about the Mafia. Please subscribe to mine and Sal's Patreon account to watch all of our full exclusive videos about Sal's life in the Mafia. The link to subscribe to our Patreon channel is in the video description below.